Well, it's the holiday period, and during this time, sometimes I like to read, and I'm guessing that maybe you do as well. So I want to give you 4 books that I've read this year that I want to commend to you to read through this holiday period. So let's get into it. One of the things I really enjoy about this time of year is the ability to just sit back for a little bit and do a little bit of reading. And I normally get through between, around the Christmas to the New Year break, 3 or 4 books. And I enjoy doing that. And so I thought what might be fun, and I did this kind of last year as well. I gave a list of books that I'd been looking at throughout the year, and it was a slightly different format then. This year it's much more of a casual kind of format, and maybe that's just because the channel and how it's going and all that kind of thing. But anyway, I wanted to give you 4 books that I've read this year that I want to commend to you to consider reading through this holiday period. The first of them really comes about, and this was a really timely book, I think, not just because of everything that's happened this year, but I think this first book addresses some of the issues that not only as humans but as Christians I think we really need to address well, and this book does a great job of that. It's a book by Gavin Ortlund called Finding the Right Hills to Die On. It was released just this year. It's about theological triage. And the idea of theological triage is essentially breaking doctrine, if you like, into those that are critical or primary, those that are not so critical but which you might not go to the same church as somebody if you disagreed on, secondary doctrines, and then tertiary doctrines, which are really doctrines that you can be in the same church and it really doesn't make a big difference. So the first category, the primary doctrines, these are ones that you either believe them or you're kind of not a Christian. Secondary issues are issues that are, they're going to make a distinction between one denomination and another, such as church polity, or perhaps even in some cases sign gifts and things like that, perhaps. And then the third group is the tertiary group, like I mentioned, and these are things that are much less critical, perhaps like eschatology, or how particular things should be interpreted. For instance, whether the rock in Matthew chapter 16, upon this rock I will build my church, refers to Peter, or whether it refers to the confession or something like that. This book walks you through really how to take those concepts and then use them on a day-to-day kind of basis with people in the church, with general society, in the Twitter sphere, and so that we can not only maintain a degree of unity, but we can also understand where we need to draw lines and why. And this is a really helpful book. So this year has been a very polarizing year, and Christians have been, even things like, the race debate and some of these kinds of things have really pulled Christians apart in a lot of ways. And this book, I felt, was a really good and helpful book to start to think through some of those issues. How do we maintain unity with some of those issues? And even asking the question, do we really understand? Do I understand enough to really be able to make a solid stand on this question? So this is a good book, and I want to commend this to you. In fact, if you're going to read just one of these books, this would be the one that I would commend to you the most, because I think one of the biggest needs we have in the world of Christianity today is to actually learn how to disagree with one another without actually making things into a fight, and that we don't need to, because we divide over things that really aren't always necessary. And unfortunately, in many cases, when we do divide over these things, we do so out of a mind of ignorance in a lot of cases, without really listening to the other side. And this is a great book that kind of helps to bring some of those focuses back to us so that we do understand what the issues are, and we do understand where we can be united and where we can't. And frankly, I think that we as Christians have more to unite around, at least publicly, than we do divide. And I really want to encourage you to think through these things carefully. So, Finding the Right Hill to Die On by Gavin Ortlund, great book. I want to commend this one to you. It was released this year and is worth reading over the Christmas break. The second book I want to commend to you was a book that I reviewed earlier this year, and I'll leave a link to it just up here, called Reading the New Testament as Christian Scripture by Constantine Campbell and Jonathan Pennington. Now, I really enjoyed this book, not only because it was the first survey book that I had read in a year or two, and so in that sense it was really refreshing, and I enjoyed just sort of working through the New Testament again to remind myself of the background and some of the issues with regards to all of the books, and it was nice and refreshing. And honestly, I don't read as much of the New Testament as I would like to. And so this was a great book just to sort of go back, to refresh myself on some of those things that I'd done through seminary and even through my doctorate as well. And just sort of get another fresh view on it. So this is a great book. In addition to obviously just walking through the New Testament, it also gives you some helpful background information, such as, you know, working through some of the key issues in each book. And one of the things I appreciated about this book was that it does a good job of really pulling New Testament positions and presuppositions and arguments into music and art that have then been with us throughout the last 2,000 years or so. And so I appreciated this element of the book. This is a book, like I mentioned, I've reviewed it previously, and you can find the link up here. So I commend this one to you as well. It's not a really long book for a New Testament introduction. It's very readable. So if, as a first introduction or a survey of the New Testament, this is very accessible, very readable, and I think sets a really good foundation for further reading in the future if you wanted to do that. So, Reading the New Testament as Christian Scripture by Jonathan Pennington and Constantine Campbell. The third one that I want to commend to you is Rediscovering the Church Fathers by Michael A.G. Haykin. And now, while Reading the New Testament as Christian Scripture and Finding the Right Hill to Die On are both books that were released this year, this book is not released this year. This book was released, I think, it's probably over a decade old now. But this year was I'm not sure if this was the first or second. I think this is the second time I read this book. One of the things I love about this book is that for a book on the Church Fathers, it's very accessible. Dr. Haykin has written this from the point of view of a number of short biographies. And those short biographies are really very easy to read, and they focus around the key issues that each of these church fathers had to face during the first 400-500 years of church history. And the value of a book like this is that so many people, in fact, even in the YouTube comments, sometimes you find people who make arguments, and it's almost like when they make these arguments, they are thinking that there is this void in New Testament history, right? So the New Testament happened, nothing was going on for about 400, 500 years, and then the New Testament got compiled, and everything before that is kind of forgotten. And that's really not a very good understanding of church history. And if we don't have that understanding of those first few hundred years and the kinds of doctrines that were being argued and the basis of those arguments and the philosophical assumptions that were behind them and how the New Testament, well, post-New Testament authors and thinkers actually argued those, we're going to come to Christianity generally with a neutered view of our faith. We're going to come with a view of our faith that sort of takes it out of history and makes it into something that is not real, something that is just sort of made up. It's whatever I want it to be, rather than seeing that we live in the tradition of a heritage that's a couple of thousand years old now, and there's a lot of richness in that. And not only that, but again, as we read through the New Testament in Greek, particularly in Master New Testament Greek, we do dip into some of these New Testament writers. And so having this biography of some of these guys and some of the things they were writing about and the issues that they were dealing with helps us to understand their writings before we get to them. And also, of course, when we do get to them, we get to them in Master New Testament Greek, at least in Greek, which means that we get to sort of engage in the language as well as in the arguments that they're making too, which again is very helpful for us as Christians because we're no longer stuck in our 21st century mindset. And that's really important. If we're stuck in a 21st century understanding of Christianity, then it's very likely that we're going to miss the riches and the treasures that are there and the focus that the New Testament itself gives that these early writers were aware of. So taking ourselves out of the 21st century into those ancient sources and writers is really, really helpful. And this is a great book to give you an introduction to this. And if you are a Master New Testament Greek member, you can go into the community and find our introduction or our discussion that we had with Dr. Haykin about this book earlier in the year as well. So, Rediscovering the Church Fathers by Michael A.G. Haykin. I'll leave a link to all of these books in the link in the description below. But before I go, I have one more book that I want to suggest. Before I tell you what this one is though, I want to ask you if you've subscribed to this channel. If not, go ahead, hit the subscribe button and the notify bell and hit the like button as well, just to let me know if this is a helpful video or not. The last book I want to recommend to you is actually really it's not about the New Testament, it's not about Greek, it's kind of a little bit left field, but I want to include it because this year has been a really interesting year. There are two things that I think this year has really heightened, at least for me. One of those, obviously with the pandemic, has been health, right? Am I looking after myself? Am I being healthy? Am I getting out and doing exercise? All those kinds of things. And then how does the virus work? How do vaccines work? You know, all those kinds of things. Now that's not so interesting. I think we kind of do enough of that in high school that, you know, we kind of have a bit of an idea of how that works. But the other thing that's really been interesting to me this year is, what about all these stimulus checks? And what about all of this economic uncertainty that's taken place this year as well? And so I've been digging a little bit into economics this year, and I want to commend to you a book on economics written by a Roman Catholic economics professor from France, written about 2007, 2008, somewhere around there, from the Austrian economics school. Now, the Austrian school of economics is it's kind of libertarian, it's kind of individualistic in terms of, and it's kind of a free market approach to economics, which is a very different approach in a lot of ways to the government regulated approach that we have to economics today. So this takes a very different approach to the way we see economics working in the world today and helps us to think through it. Now the book is called The Ethics of Money Production. And here's where this gets kind of interesting. The argument of this book is that when it comes to the production of money, and we're talking about money, we're talking really here about currency. One of the key arguments of this book is that there should not be a tight government control over currency. It's helpful for the government, but it's not necessarily helpful for the general populace. And the arguments this book makes were really quite interesting. I'd never come across these arguments before. I kind of seen them in tweets and places, you know, in social media occasionally, but I hadn't read anything on it. And this book it wasn't the first book I read on economics. I read a couple of others before this, and I've read since then. But this one was helpful in terms of it's dealing with it from an ethical point of view. And as a Roman Catholic scholar, that's one of the things I appreciate. It's peppered with scripture throughout to argue from the scripture the ethical position that he's arguing for. So I found this to be a really interesting book. And it's different, right? He talks about different forms of money, certificates, paper money, coins, and so one of the arguments, people you sometimes hear is we need to go back onto the gold standards. Well, this book would have you think differently about that. And, the gold standard has its place, but anyway, I'm babbling. The point here is this was a thought-provoking book for me, and I think it might be a thought-provoking book for you. It's not strictly a Christian book, granted, but it's interesting, and, I want to commend it to you as well. Particularly if you just want a break from Greek and theology, this book might be worth looking at. But let me ask you, I'm interested in reading books over this Christmas break as well. Have you got any books that you think I should read? Leave us a comment in the comment section below, and I look forward to looking at some of those, if I can, over the Christmas break as well. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you so much for subscribing to this channel and supporting this channel, particularly through 2020. And I look forward to serving you again in the next video. Until then, keep taking small but consistent steps toward mastery, and I'll see you then.